Now, Melissa Clark-Reynolds is stepping down from her role as independent director at Beef and Lamb New Zealand at the end of the year, but she is excited about the future of the primary sector. With food service overseas under pressure due to lockdown, the emphasis has gone back on retail sales. Melissa joins us now on Cirrus Country. Kia ora, Melissa. Welcome to Cirrus Country. It's an absolute privilege and pleasure to have you on the show.
Oh, g'day. It's lovely to be here. I'm a real fan, so it's great to be on the show rather than just listening to it.
Oh, thank you so much. And can I just say, our mutual, girl crush there too, especially on Lindy Nelson's great new podcast. I'm just going to give a wee plug there because I know she'll be watching.
Amplifying Us.
Amplifying Us.
It's such a great podcast. Like the whole season is just interviews with phenomenal women. It's been a joy to both be on one and to listen to the series. Amazing. Mavis Mullins. I mean, it's just all sorts of incredible women that she has been able to showcase because of her deep relationships in the sector. It's fantastic.
I know, and I think we feel like we're jumping the gun because we're going to have Lisa Sims, a GM from Agri-Women's Development Trust, later on in Cirrus Country to talk about Lindy's fantastic work. But, an absolute segue back into what we were talking around our traditional markets being extremely disruptive because of COVID. But let's talk about your role as an independent director on Beef and Lamb New Zealand and actually bringing your skill set and background and passion for agility to the table, especially in a year like 2020.
Yeah, it's been an interesting year. So, I work as a strategist for a number of companies outside of my beef and lamb directorship, and most of those are in the primary sector or provide services to the primary sector. And so in my futurist role, because I'm kind of nerdy, I have a Google alert for novel zoonoses. And so I'm constantly looking for what's the next M. bovis, what's the next African swine flu. If we think about last year we had a boomer year in the meat sector thanks to a global pandemic which affected pigs. And so the African swine flu impact is why we did so well in China as a country last year. So I'm constantly looking for those so that I can keep an eye on where our markets might get disrupted, where our logistics might get disrupted. And so in December, I started watching what at the time just looked like a chest virus, basically, that had jumped from a bat to a pangolin to a human in China. And the first reports were about 27 people sick. But by early February, China had run out of containers. And so for the New Zealand meat industry, that's a really big deal because if we can't get product in and out of China, it's really important. And so I feel like it's been a long year, like it's almost a year since that first novel zoonoses came up. It's only about 2 weeks off a year for me, having been thinking about this virus. So the disruption has happened in a number of ways, but what I would say is that this year will still be, if not a record year for the meat industry, pretty close to it. Thanks to massive disruption in American production, we're getting great prices in the US. So the meat industry in the US was the biggest cluster for a long time for the pandemic. So they've had hundreds of thousands now of sick people related to meat processing in the US. And so our ability to provide good, safe food into the US food industry has been enormous. So I know it hasn't necessarily gone into food service, but it's going into supermarkets. People like First Light who are doing direct to consumer, I think that's really smart. And I see that they're starting to launch more and more direct-to-consumer within New Zealand. I'm on the board of Atkins Ranch as well, and we're having a really good year in terms of Whole Foods and Amazon. So I actually think there's been more opportunity in COVID for New Zealand meat industry than there would have been otherwise.
It feels like to me, Melissa, that was where the opportunity for our meat industry actually lied all the way along. COVID was the kick up the butt it needed.
Yeah. Well, I think I was kind of watching the food service thing because I think where food service as a target market is interesting is that a lot of countries don't eat lamb the way we eat lamb. It's like 3 or 4% of the American meat category is lamb. And so if you might choose it in a restaurant, you might have the courage to go home and cook it yourself. And so I think there is a lot of sense in New Zealand companies targeting food into the food service as a way of getting people to taste something new. However, this year, because beef has been so hard to get hold of, a lot of consumers have switched to ground lamb in particular. I don't think New Zealand's going to be able to produce enough racks this year, which home cooks are really willing to do. And the winter is coming in the US, and I think we all know people eat more meat in the winter. So I'm really hopeful about not just this year, but next year as well, actually.
Let's talk about volume to value. It's like a broken record in the primary sector in terms of our future. But you are still dedicated to this, and that is the future for New Zealand, and really need to pull back and stop focusing so heavily on the move of plant-based proteins.
Yeah, well, I think, people are going to eat plant-based protein. And today I was posting a few things on Twitter where, we've seen the skyrocketing of plant-based milk in particular. And oat milk is now the second biggest category of plant-based milk. That category is not going away. But what we also, I think we should be aiming at is thinking if people are going to eat less meat, which they probably are, then what we want them to do is eat better meat and pay more for that meat. So ultimately, I think for farmers, what we want to do is we want to be sure that people have been paid the best income they can possibly be paid for producing really high quality animals. And so if you can get twice as much off an animal, twice as much revenue, that's better for everyone. It's better for the climate, it's better for our customers, it's better for farmers. So for me, that's part of that pushing to the top of the market. I want to come back to the US market for a second, because this year what's really interesting is while meat prices generally have been high, they've been extraordinarily high for what's called claims-based meat. And so this year, organic meat, GAP meat, non-GMO and non-antibiotic meat has all received an even higher premium, well above the rest of the high prices that we're seeing. And so it won't be for everybody, but for some farmers who want to get that extra premium, they might have to put a bit more work in, like becoming GAP certified or going organic. But there are much higher prices to be had in the marketplace for those claims-based meats, particularly in the pandemic era, because what people want is they want to be thinking about building their immunity. And as they're building their immunity, they want to buy what they consider to be the highest quality protein they can get. And what we're seeing is plant-based proteins aren't featuring quite so much in people's thinking about how to build immunity, but they do think meat. And then they do think organic or antibiotic-free or GMO-free meat is the healthier meat that they can buy.
I found that interesting.
So
the words what they consider, and based on the information that they have at hand through the lens of their experience. One thing you say in this wonderful article, thanks to Colin Williscroft at Farmers Weekly, is around data and how we capture the opportunities of data, but at the same time we really have to up our broadband to get there. But let's talk about data being that absolute goldmine of storytelling.
It's in a bunch of ways. So there's the storytelling, but there's also, if we look at, to say again, the lamb industry in New Zealand, we've doubled our revenue off half the animals, and we've done that through massive genetics gains in particular. But you think if we can improve our genetic gains, and particularly I think we need to focus on taste and genetics, so we need a lot of data to know, does China as a market like this flavour or that flavour? Do Americans like this flavour or that flavour? There's a whole lot of data we need to collect around the relationship between things like intramuscular fat, the genetics of the animal, the feed that animal had, the weight at which it goes off to be processed, and then what happens post-process and how does that animal end up with the most optimal taste for that market. So that's one piece of data that data will provide us with higher income right from the start. Then there's also all of the data we need in order to prove our claims. So how do we prove that this is a GMO-free animal? How do we prove that it's an antibiotic-free animal? How do we prove that it was grass-fed? And those data points absolutely need to be done. But also there are some others, like the amount that we waste. So if I look at some of the milk production, what if we knew at the animal level that this animal, that its milk shouldn't go into the vat? And at the moment, what happens is that we're testing a whole vat of milk rather than being able to personalise it to one cow. And so if one cow has an issue, the vat can be spoiled. Or even worse, on some farms, that vat goes into a tanker and maybe 3 or 4 farms' milk gets spoiled. And we could actually, again, get a much higher price if we can reduce our wastage on the way through.
It's interesting, just to all of your points, actually. I went to a great launch of the Agri-Tech Industry Transformational Plan last week, and there was a huge part there around data ownership and how it will have to be both a carrot and a stick to bring in the regulatory needs to make sure that the ownership of data is passed through that chain, especially when it comes to things like genetics and taste all the way through.
Absolutely. And I think the ownership shouldn't stop us, though, from getting moving on being able to access the right tools on farm, being able to put the right scanners in and all of that. And this is, I know I'm going to run out of time in a minute, so I do just want to talk about broadband. The Isle of Jersey, right, it had, they were one of the first that rolled out really rural broadband out to every farm on the island. And they now have an average speed of 218 megabits per second. Okay, so 218 megabits per second is their average. In New Zealand, we have an average of about 14.7. And on top of that, the Rural Broadband Initiative is trying to get everyone up to 20, which is 1/10 of the speed of what a farmer in Jersey has. And so when we think about that, and that's download speed, not upload speed. I know this is a little technical, but if we're going to really be able to do really good data-driven precision agriculture on farm, and I've been banging on about this for 10 years now, then what we have to have is good upload speed as well, because I have to be able to put my data up into the cloud. It has to be analyzed, and I need to be able to pull it back down. I can't just have a download speed. Okay, it'll be faster for me to watch Netflix on farm, but that's not really what we're talking about here. What we're talking about here is how do we pull our data in a way that be able to benchmark each other, that we know that we've got high quality meat and dairy that is going out to the world and that we can guarantee its provenance. Those are the areas that will actually make us money as a country, and we're being hamstrung by a ridiculously slow both upload, but even worse, our download speed. So for me, if we're going to be able to get irrigation right, if we're going to be able to get the genetics right, if we're going to be able to get feed right, and if we want to get the highest prices in our market, we have to have access to these data tools. And these data tools can't work at the kinds of, ridiculously slow broadband speeds that we've got. So if you've got broadband, I know Lundy, they struggle on farm to even get broadband. But if we're only aiming to get 20 megabits, which is 1/10 of what Jersey has, and that's what we're hoping to roll out now, we're going to be behind the global economy for a very long time.
I was just thinking I might lead the protest to the steps of Parliament because it only helps Sarah's Country streaming across rural New Zealand just as much.
Count me in.
Thank you so much. Absolute privilege to have Melissa Clark-Reynolds on Sarah's Country tonight. And this is following the latest story from Colin Willis-Crofts in this week's Farmers Weekly, titled Challenges Ahead but Opportunities Abound. Available now at farmersweekly.co.nz. This is Sarah's Country.